met Florence in 2012. I was doing a needs assessment in the highlands of Zimbabwe, and I spent about a week with a group of women artisans, and Florence was one of them. After a few days, I asked her if she'd be willing to sit down with me and answer a few questions. There were 66, in fact. She didn't know that, so she agreed. Florence has 4 kids and lives in a rural area where she and her family survive on subsistence farming. She has no help from her husband, neither material nor moral. Years ago, he left to go to the capital, Harare, to work and earn money for his family, but that never happened. Instead, he's kept busy with booze and women, which means that the specter of HIV looms large for Florence. Because on the rare occasions when he comes home to his village, he still expects relations with his wife. And although he doesn't bring home much money, she knows it's only a matter of time before he does bring home HIV. Florence has one teenage daughter. She's trying desperately to keep her in boarding school. Boarding school? This seems sort of unnecessarily luxurious to me, so I asked her about it. Turns out that if you have a teenage daughter away from home in a boarding school, it's the one surefire way that she will study and graduate instead of fetching water and firewood, cooking for her brothers, working in the fields, and doing every other important but menial chore that girls do, because that's their value, that's the resource they are. Boarding school also saves Florence's daughter from the reality of a regular day school, which involves leaving late in the morning after helping with the chores, walking 45 minutes to and from school, only getting home close to dark and having to help with more chores, finally only being able to sit down to study late at night by the light of paraffin candles, which will slowly, surely destroy her lungs. And by then, she's too tired to learn much anyway. And as an added bonus, boarding school means that she's not very likely to get married and have kids as a barely pubescent child herself. Mostly, it seems, because she's out of sight, out of mind. And so, Florence struggles to keep her daughter in school, to keep herself and her 3 other kids fed, to manage her husband's farm, to which she has no legal claim and never will, all so that she and her family can survive for years to come. Sadly, Florence is not alone. The vast majority of the world's poor are women. And the women are also among those considered extremely poor. In fact, they're the majority of those considered extremely poor. They're often single parents. For many, malnourishment, famine, no access to water are all daily realities. And often they're legally prevented from owning land, and so from building wealth and resilience. It's now widely accepted that when women are empowered, and here I'll talk about economic empowerment, which is associated with other types of empowerment and leadership. When women are empowered, there are positive long-term impacts in many of these areas. Life expectancy increases, HIV transmission is reduced, maternal mortality is reduced, even GDP increases. And I could go on, but you get the point. The point is that when you invest in women, you get a big return on your investment. So these are important facts, aren't they? I'm a historian, and I'm a feminist, and I am really interested in women's issues and in how societies and cultures change their views about women's roles. So these types of facts are important to me. I didn't realize how important these facts were until I traveled to India 12 years ago, and I witnessed all this in real life. I was stunned by how much needed doing in the world, and by how unfair it was that I had so many advantages that other women would never have, and also by how little I was contributing to a solution with my own life. I was so shocked by this that I really had to do some thinking about it. That was my first real trip to the developing world, and I went there with my childhood friend and her father. He'd been born there. He'd had one of those stories, that you hear about, but you kind of can't quite grasp. He'd had to walk barefoot to school every morning, 45 minutes. He'd struggled to go to university. He'd scraped together the means to immigrate to Canada, and he gave his kids the life he never had. He'd gone back and he'd started a little school there, just boys and girls being educated in a little shack. But I felt really lucky because on that trip, I realized not only how much needed doing in the world, but also how much one person could make a difference. In the lives of those 15 or so kids, one person made a huge difference. 15 kids a year, year after year, family after family. I went on with my life, still thinking that I needed my government job, my pension, my security, my 3-bedroom house, my car, thinking that I was happy with that, or maybe that I should be happy with that. But that seed grew in me until it was something I really needed to do something about. In retrospect, it's amazing to me, and a little embarrassing, that it took me so long to realize that the way I was using my life was destroying my soul. I was a historian in a dream job. I had done the follow your heart thing all my life. It just never occurred to me. So by the time I realized I was unhappy, I was seriously unhappy. I could hardly sleep. I cried all the time for no reason. I lived on Zantac and alcohol. My whole life was like an open wound. Everything was so incredibly raw. But on the surface, everything looked great, even to me. I was a manager for the government, and my boss sent me for communications coaching. And it was my coach who said to me, you don't actually need a coach, you need a therapist. She was right. I ended up being diagnosed with depression. I spent 2 years in therapy and on antidepressants, and I finally realized that I wasn't doing what I needed to do on this planet, in my life, with my life. And when I sat with myself and I really thought about when I had been happiest, I realized that it was when I was serving others, when I was helping others on their path. And this was a revelation to me. It had completely escaped my attention that contributing to others, moving and being moved by them, was the source of joy. I had just not noticed. So once I did, I had to figure out how to get my life on that track. And it took time and research and thinking and feeling. I recommend feeling. But eventually I quit my job and I left town and I embarked on a new journey, one which led me with some twists and turns to found a charity to support women in their quest for financial independence through entrepreneurship training. It took time and many people to bring the program I had envisioned into the world. But about 2 years ago, I oversaw the training of 21 women in Latin America. Thank you. And the program was designed to provide them with really concrete tools to create a sustainable living for themselves in tangible, actionable ways. And it worked. So within a year, the women were generating, on average, almost 60% more sales than the year before. Thank you. For many, this means going from below the poverty line to above it. And that's just the stuff we can measure, because the stuff we really did was so much more. It's a 5-day intensive training program, and in 5 days, I watched those women, some of them, urban and kind of edgy and raw, others rural, meek, naive. I watched them step into what was possible for themselves and their futures. I watched them over 5 days as they began to see themselves as teachers and businesswomen and leaders. And in just 1 year of coaching, they created real change in their lives. This is Verna. Verna's a timid single mother, and she was so ashamed on the first day because she couldn't read. Now she's manager of a store, and she was able to send for her 9-year-old daughter from the village so she could raise her herself. This is Monica. Monica is a self-deprecating domestic abuse survivor. Monica is now enjoying so much success in her small business that she had to hire another woman to help her. She's also now training other rural artisans in the skills they need to run their own micro-businesses. And this is Reina. Reina was a kind of combative mother of 3, and she was constantly worried about making ends meet. Reina was able to convince a bank to lend her money so she could buy a plot of land, and she's now building a home for her family. One of the things that kept coming up also was communication. The women told us that after the training program, they were much better able to communicate. They felt that they could communicate better not only with their customers, which was part of what we taught them, but also with everyone in their lives, with their families, their husbands, their kids. When I started to unpack that, I realized that this is actually the core of empowerment and leadership. They had begun to see the opportunity to create the relationships they wanted for themselves. And they had experienced it as a real possibility. And they now had the confidence, not only in themselves, but also in the process, in the world, to begin to communicate their vision of what they saw for themselves. And in communicating it, they began to create it. This is real empowerment. But there are still so many women out there who don't have the opportunities that we take for granted. What can we do? Well, we can do many things. But it all starts with this. We need to dare to care. We must allow ourselves to be touched and to let that feeling inspire and guide us in the risk we take and the difference we make. Over the course of this training program, which involved a year of bi-weekly coaching calls with the women, there were a lot of challenges. I'd say by the last 6 months, we were in full firefighting mode. It was difficult to see the positives, and although we plowed forward and our coaches kept calling the women, we were all really struggling with what looked like failure. Failure to implement the program the way it had been designed, failure to effectively support the women. By the end, our sort of coping mantra became, let's just see how we can get this right next time. So when we went back a year later to talk to the women, we were astonished, frankly, by their big successes, everything from those sales increases to the better relationships with their kids. But our real impact and power became clear to me as we were wrapping up a final meeting with some of the original participants. The women were asked if they had any final comments or questions or suggestions, and they said, "Thank you for not giving up on us. You never gave up on us, no matter what we did, and we are so thankful." I left that meeting in tears. What had really mattered, and what's so hard to capture in all the metrics, is the impact of not giving up on someone, of caring enough to not give up. Caring is scary, but it's the start and the end of how we can make a difference. We must dare to care. Thank you.